If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. I just wanted to remind you that this podcast has merch, and this podcast is also on Patreon, and there's some perks that come along with joining the Patreon. I will leave the links to both of those things in the show notes. In 20th century Sweden, there was a family that struggled with just getting by. They were struggling when they were a family of 4, but then they became a family of 5, and things got harder. But that 5th person would be a girl with big dreams. She would be a girl that would vow to rise above the life she was given. She would be a girl that would turn into a woman that would go on to live many lives, all for the whole world to see. But even though she had the whole world right in the palm of her hand, in her personal life, the whole world wasn't able to fix the brokenness she unexplainably felt. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 24th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. We are in season 4 of History Shelf, and it is titled They Are a Rainbow. This season of History Shelf, I will be covering each week a historical figure that was part of the LGBTQIA community. These were people that during their time they had to hide a part of their identity from the world. So while I fully believe that those who are out and proud in their lifetime, even if it had the potential to cost them everything, deserve to be praised and recognized, those are not the people that I will be covering this season. I am covering the ones that were made to love in the shadows, the ones that had to lie to most or all of the people around them. Now, I know that sexual orientation and gender identity are complex, and some of the terms that I will use to describe these subjects were not around in some of their lifetimes. So some of these subjects obviously would not have used the same words to describe themselves as I will be using. But I don't want to get too hung up on my wording. I just want to celebrate a part of these individuals that in their time there was pressure all around them to feel shame about. I want to focus on that love and gender are not black and white. They are a rainbow. And for this week, I am talking about Greta Garbo. Greta Garbo was born Greta Lovisa Gustafsson on September 18th, 1905 in Södermalm, Stockholm, Sweden at 7:30 p.m. But if you would have asked Greta her name before that she was 11, she would have told you that her name was Kata, because that was the way that she mispronounced her name for the first 10 years of her life. So that became her nickname. Greta's mother was Anna Lovisa Karlsson, and her father was Carl Alfred Gustafsson. Anna and Carl had 3 children. Sven Alfred, born in 1898, Alva Maja, born in 1903, and then Greta. I'm sorry if I mispronounced any of those names. I don't know any Swedish. I know that Greta's sister's middle name in English would be pronounced Maria, but I try to always say the correct pronunciation if I can. But like I said, I know absolutely no Swedish. English is my first language. I know some Spanish and a little bit of French, but other than that, I know no other language. So I'm sorry to all my Swedish listeners if I just butchered one of those names. Greta was a surprise arrival. Before Greta's birth, her family was already struggling financially. So adding another mouth to feed to the household did not help with their money problems. Greta's father worked at a jam factory, but he was often out of work and he had poor health. The place where Greta grew up was a 3-bedroom flat that only had cold water. The area where their flat was was seen as the city's slum. This is what Greta said about where she grew up. Quote, "It was eternally gray, those long winter nights. My father would be sitting in a corner scribbling figures on a newspaper. On the other side of the room, my mother is repairing ragged old clothes, sighing. We children would be talking in very low voices or just sitting silently. We were filled with anxiety as if there were danger in the air. Such evenings are unforgettable for a sensitive girl, but also for a girl like me. Where we lived, all the houses and apartments looked alike, their ugliness matched by everything surrounding us." End quote. The acting bug bit Greta at a young age. She had an interest in theater and she dreamed about becoming an actress. She would often direct her friends in make believe games and performances, but she often preferred to play alone. At 13 years old, Greta graduated from school. She did not go on to high school because she had to take care of her ill father, but Greta never liked school much anyway. In 1920, Greta's father died of kidney failure due to kidney disease. Greta vowed to herself after her father's death that she was going to make a better life for herself and she would never know poverty ever again. Greta's first job was a soap lather girl in a barber shop. Then she got a job at a Swedish department store. The department store needed help promoting their men's clothing line, so they had Greta model the clothes in an advertisement. That got her noticed by Eric Arthur Petchler. He gave her a part in his short film Peter the Tramp. Greta earned a scholarship to study at Royal Dramatic Theatre from 1922 to 1924. This school was a very prestigious acting school. Greta didn't finish her education there because she met the director Moritz Stiller. He was Sweden's leading silent film director. Moritz wanted Greta to be the star of his silent film, The Legend of Gustav Berling. The film was a success in Sweden and Germany. Moritz was the one that convinced Greta to change her last name to Garbo. Greta's next film would really change her life. The movie was called Streets of Sorrow. Streets of Sorrow caught the attention of MGM's production chief, Louis B. Mayer. Louis wanted Moritz to come work for MGM in America. Moritz said he would go, but he had one condition. That condition was that Greta had to come with him. Louis grudgingly agreed to Moritz's term. Greta was on her way to Hollywood, California. The year was 1925. Greta was 19 years old and she was surrounded by the bright lights of Hollywood. Greta didn't take to the Hollywood life right away. She didn't want to talk to the press and she didn't want people to know anything about her private life. In her first interview that she ever did, she told reporters, quote, "I was born, I had a mother and father, I went to school, what does it matter?" End quote. Let me remind you that MGM didn't really want Greta. She was something they had to take to get Moritz. But MGM did put her in a film. It was The Torrent. Her character was a Spanish peasant that wanted to make it big as an opera singer. The movie was not directed by Moritz. Moritz had an argument with MGM executives and he left them for Paramount. That didn't work out either. He had issues with the people there too. So he packed his bags and he moved back to Sweden and died a year later in 1928. But Greta was another story. Greta proved to be a massive hit for MGM. The actress they didn't want quickly became one of their biggest stars. In fact, she became their biggest star. She was in the films The Temptress and Fresh and the Devil. Both of those films were huge hits. But the success didn't make Greta happy. Greta felt like she didn't fit into the Hollywood scene. She longed for her homeland of Sweden. MGM had just found gold. There was no chance in hell that they were letting her go. So they gave her a new deal. They gave her a new contract that gave her a record of $270,000 per movie. That's over $4 million in today's money. And they gave her unprecedented control over the roles she played and the films that she starred in. MGM offered this huge deal to Greta because in 1925 to 1926, Greta's first 3 films made up 13% of MGM's profits. Greta knew this, and she knew that gave her power. She knew that she could use this to keep her from the poverty that she endured in her childhood. So that was part of the reason why she threatened to go back to Sweden. Greta's co-star in the movie Flesh and the Devil was John Gilbert. What Greta and John's relationship was is not entirely clear. There's been some debate. It has been reported that John fell in love with Greta at first sight. The chemistry between the two could be seen in the tragic love story on screen. But what about their love story? It was reported that they got swept up in their emotions. It took 3 weeks to film Flesh and the Devil, and by the end of filming, Greta and John were talking marriage. According to the director of the film, Clarence Brown, he said that John started proposing almost immediately. Some even go as far as to say that John was the one that kept Greta acting and in America. Some say that Greta told John that she would marry him and quit acting. John told her that he wanted to marry her, but he didn't want her to give up her career. Some accounts say that Greta took this as John saying that he didn't actually want to marry her and he just wanted her as an acting partner. Greta and John lived together intermittently in 1926 and 1927. John also helped Greta with dealing with the life in Hollywood, like how to act at parties and with the press. They starred in 3 more films from 1927 to 1933. They were Love, A Woman of Affairs, and Queen Christina, where Greta played History Shelf alumni Queen Christina of Sweden. More on that movie in a little later. The film director, producer, and screenwriter King Vidor was marrying actress Eleanor Boardman. John had arranged for them to have a double wedding. King and Eleanor would say their vows, and then Greta and John would say theirs. The day of the wedding arrived, but Greta was nowhere to be seen. she never showed. John was extremely upset, which is understandable. I have never been left at the altar, but I imagine that that would be very devastating. John went into the bathroom to weep. Louis B. Mayer came into the bathroom and told John, quote, "Sleep with her. Don't marry her," end quote. John punched Louis in the face. Louis was on the bathroom floor with his eyeglasses in pieces, and he allegedly told John, quote, "I will destroy you," end quote. Some believe that Louis did in fact destroy John, but it is possible that John's career took a nosedive because John was getting paid so much and his movies weren't making as much as he was getting paid. His career started to decline. In 1931, the LA Times wrote a story that called John Hollywood's unhappiest man. He married the actress Ina Claire, but their marriage ended in divorce. In divorce court, John said, quote, he wanted to be left alone, end quote. He was paraphrasing a famous line associated with Greta, at least as far back as 1929. John died of a heart attack on January 9th, 1936. He was 38 years old. This is what Greta said about not marrying John. Quote, I was in love with him, but I froze. I was afraid he would tell me what to do and boss me. I always wanted to be the boss. End quote. Years later, she said, quote, I can't remember what I ever saw in him. End quote. According to Ava Gardner's autobiography, Greta told her that John had let her down by having an affair with an extra on the last film that they did together, and she was unable to forgive him. Now, I told you that there is debate surrounding their relationship. Some believe that their relationship was just a PR stunt. Perhaps it was because the relationships that they were playing on screen was a lot like their relationship in real life. The actress Lois Brooks said that she had an affair with Greta. Lois claimed that the two lovebirds were actually a lie created by MGM to cover up the fact that Greta was bisexual. There are some that actually believe that Greta was more into women than she was men. Others think that Greta was not that interested in sex at all, so maybe she was asexual, which doesn't necessarily mean that Greta's relationship with John, or anyone else for that matter, was fake, because, again, asexual does not necessarily mean aromantic. You can be both, or you can be just one. So, as I was saying earlier, Greta's popularity was growing. People were taking notice of her talent. Film historian and critic David Denby argues that she introduced a subtlety of expression to the art of silent acting, and that its effect on the audience cannot be exaggerated. During this time, Greta started having unusual demands. She didn't have any diva-like demands. It was nothing like that. But her demands were odd. When she was shooting, she didn't allow any visitors. She demanded that black flats or screens surround her to prevent extras and technicians from watching her. When asked about this, she said, quote, if I am by myself, my face will do things I cannot do with it otherwise. End quote. As time went on, technology advanced. Studios started making talkies, movies that had sound. MGM was the last Hollywood studio to convert to sound. The last silent film MGM did was The Kiss. It was also the last silent film that Greta did. MGM was worried that Greta's Swedish accent would hurt her career. That fear may sound silly, but there were silent actors that found themselves out of work once movies got sound. Not all of them had a voice that could sell. So, was MGM's cash cow going to be the latest victim of sound? Greta's first speaking role was in Anna Christie in 1930. Her first line was, quote, "Give me a whiskey, ginger ale on the side, and don't be stingy, baby," end quote. The movie premiered in New York City on February 21st, 1930, and it was publicized with the advertisement Garbo Talks. It became MGM's biggest grossing film for that year. Greta had defeated the curse that took other silent film actors. Not only did she beat the curse, but the film earned her her first Academy Award for Best Actress nomination. Her first comedy with sound was Nina Ichka, and it was publicized with the advertisement Garbo Laughs. She went on to star in other talkies, including Susan Lennox, Her Fall, and Rise. In that film, she was paired with the up-and-coming star Clark Gable. She was actually cast in that to help boost Clark's career. One of her best remembered roles is her role in the 1931 film Metahari. She played a German spy during World War I in that. It apparently caused panic when it was released, and police had to keep the waiting mob in order. Her next film was Grand Hotel. I'm not going to mention every film she was in, but I will mention the big ones. Grand Hotel was an all-star cast film. It also won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Greta was friends with the writer Mercedes D'Acosta. According to both Greta and Mercedes biographers, Greta and Mercedes were in a romantic relationship. They had a friendship that lasted almost 30 years. Greta sent Mercedes 181 letters, cards, and telegrams. You can see them at Rosenbach Museum and Library. Mercedes sent Greta love poems, but it appears that the relationship was one-sided, or at least it became one-sided. In 1944, Greta told Mercedes to stop sending her love letters and poems. It is believed that Mercedes remained in love with Greta for the rest of her life. By this time, Garbomania had taken over the world. She was the it girl. She was gorgeous and talented, and she had the world wrapped around her finger. People were in awe of her. Clarence Brown said that he remembered shooting a scene with her, and it was nothing special, but when he played it back, he saw something. He said, quote, "Something that it just didn't have on the set. You could see thought. If she had to look at one person with jealousy and another with love, she didn't have to change her expression. You could see it in her eyes as she looked from one to the other." End quote. Greta came to embody unattainable elegance. Greta was in the movie As You Desire Me. After that movie, her contract with MGM was up, so Greta went back to Sweden. But, of course, MGM was in no way going to let their biggest stars slip through their fingers. MGM entered into negotiations with Greta for almost a year. Greta was willing to sign a new deal, but she had some conditions. She wanted to star in the film Queen Christina. Her salary would also increase to $300,000 a film. That is around $7 million in today's money. The screenplay also had to be written by Salka Vientil. MGM suggested to have Charles Blair or Laurence Olivier play opposite of her, but she wanted John Gilbert. This was after she left him at the altar. So during this time, John's career was going downhill. This would be their last film together. MGM didn't want to make the film. It became MGM's biggest production at the time, though. It was publicized as Garbo Returns. It received positive reviews, and it became the highest grossing film that year. Even though the movie was a huge success, there was a lot of controversy around the film. There is a scene where Greta dresses up as a man and she kisses a female co-star. This was 1933, so obviously this was going to cause some controversy. In the early 1930s, Greta's popularity took a little bit of a dip in the United States. During the Great Depression, Americans took more interest in American actors. But internationally, Greta was still a hit. In 1935, she played in the movie Anna Karenina. This role won her her first New York Film Critics Circle Award for Best Actress. She would win for a second time the next year for Camille. In 1937, Greta hit a bump in her career. She had a flop at the box office. The movie was titled Conquest, and it was one of MGM's biggest failures of the decade. In 1937, Greta also met Leopold Stokowski. He was the conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra. Their relationship was highly publicized. They traveled all around Europe together. It has been speculated that they had a romantic relationship, but we don't know for sure if they indeed did have a romantic relationship or if their relationship was just a platonic friendship. Being the world's favorite actress didn't last forever. In 1938, Greta went from being box office gold to being box office poison. The comedy Ninotchka that I mentioned earlier was supposed to revive Greta's career, and it did. It earned Greta her third Academy Award nomination, so MGM thought that comedy was the way to go with Greta's career. Melvyn Douglas was in Ninotchka, so they also put him in her next film, Two-Faced Woman. It was a hit at the box office, but critics hated it. Greta described the film as being her grave. It was her last film. The novelist Erich Maria Remarque claimed in his diary that he had an affair with Greta in 1941. Greta was friends with the fashion designer Valentina. Valentina was married to George Schlee. Greta's friend Nicholas Turner said that Greta moved into Valentina and George's apartment building and stole George from Valentina. George moved in with Greta and he divided up his time between Greta and Valentina. George remained Greta's close friend until his death in 1964. On December 7th, 1941, the United States entered into World War II. Most of Hollywood rallied the country around the war effort. But Greta largely remained silent about the war. She received a lot of criticism for not saying much. So criticizing public figures when they don't speak on issues is nothing new. There were attempts to bring Greta's career back to life. 1942 was supposed to be Greta's comeback. Greta signed a one-picture deal to do The Girl from Leningrad, but that project dissolved quickly. So the plan was she would resume her career once World War II was over. In 1948, Greta tried again to bring her career back to life. Greta still had a contract with the producer, Walter Wanger. He was the producer that produced Queen Christina. Greta was going to be in his movie Le Duc de Langeais. That movie never found the money to be made. During this time, Greta had a friendship with Cecil Beaton. Cecil was an English photographer. In Cecil's memoir, he said that he and Greta had an affair from 1947 to 1948. In 1949, Greta got an offer to play the role of the fictional silent film actress Norma Desmond in the movie Sunset Boulevard. But Greta turned down the part. Maybe she didn't feel enthused about the project, or maybe it was just that Greta was done with the Hollywood life that she had never found joy in. Everyone was eager to know when Greta was going to make her big comeback to the screen. She told the actor David Niven, quote, "I have made enough faces," end quote. When reporters asked her, she said, quote, "I have no plans either for the movies or anything else. I'm just drifting," end quote. Greta took a step back from the spotlight. She started collecting art in the 1940s. But just because she was no longer in the spotlight didn't mean that she didn't have friends. On February 9th, 1951, she became a U.S. citizen and she moved to Manhattan. In 1955, she received a Special Academy Award for her entire career. And on November 13th, 1963, Greta was invited by President John F. Kennedy to have dinner at the White House. Greta liked to go on walks by herself and with friends. In 1965, she went on a walk with a friend a few days before her 60th birthday, and she said this, quote, "In a few days, it will be the anniversary of the sorrow that never leaves me, that will never leave me for the rest of my life," end quote. Greta struggled with depression pretty much her whole life. She even told another friend in 1971, quote, "I suppose I suffer from very deep depression," end quote. One biographer thinks that she was bipolar. She once said, quote, "I am very happy one moment, the next there is nothing left for me," end quote. But I have said many times before on this podcast that it is really hard to diagnose people in the past. Luchino Visconti wanted Greta to grace the big screen again. He wanted her to play Maria Sophia, Queen of Naples, in his film Remembrance of Things Past. That film never came to be. I told you that Greta had many friends in her retirement. Friends like the dancer Devi Ja, Baroness Cecile de Rothschild, and Samuel Adams Green. Greta and Samuel's friendship ended in 1981. Samuel recorded all of his phone calls. Greta was okay with this, but Greta was falsely told that Samuel played their phone conversations for his friends, and so she ended their friendship. In 1971, she wrote to her friend Frederick Sands, quote, "I am forever running away from something or somebody. Unconsciously, I have always known that I was not destined for real and lasting happiness," end quote. Greta liked her privacy, and she preferred being called Miss Harriet Brown. Her close friends could call her Miss Garbo or Gigi, but she would not respond if they called her Greta. As time went on, she became more withdrawn, but she was very close to her cook and housekeeper, Claire Coker. They had a bond like sisters. The actress Liv Ullmann was called the new Greta Garbo, and in 1977, she played Anna Christie on Broadway. One day, Liv saw Greta in the street, and she ran after her. Greta ran from her, running into Central Park. Liv said that Greta looked scared, and so she did not run after her. In 1984, Greta got breast cancer, but she beat it. But even Hollywood legends can't live forever. On April 15th, 1990, Greta died of pneumonia and renal failure. She was 84 years old. Greta was cremated, and her ashes were interred in 1999 at, and please forgive me, I'm probably going to butcher this, Skagaborgen Cemetery just south of Stockholm. Greta never married in her life or had any children. Greta even once said, quote, "If I were ever to love anyone, it would be Moritz Stiller," end quote. So because she didn't have any children, her estate was left to her niece. Her estate was worth $32 million. Or in today's money, that's over $76 million. Many critics have said that not many of Greta's movies are actually good, but Greta is good in them. One of Greta's biographers, Karen Swinson, said, quote, "All moviegoers demanded of a Garbo production was Greta Garbo," end quote. There have been many documentaries about Greta. Two were named Garbo. One was in 1969 and the other was in 2005. There have also been others. There was the Divine Garbo, Greta Garbo, the Mysterious Lady, and Greta Garbo, a Lone Star. Greta has her own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. There is a Greta Garbo Memorial in Stockholm. There is also a sculpture of her in Stockholm. There is a statue of Greta in the forest, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing this, in Häladalen in Sweden. Romania also made a postal stamp of Greta in 2005. She was the subject of Charles Ketchlin's Seven Stars Symphony. Ernest Hemingway had an imaginary portrayal of Greta in his novel For Whom the Bell Tolls. Garbo Talks is a fictional film about a dying Greta Garbo fan that wishes to meet Greta before the fan dies. She is mentioned in the songs You're the Top by Cole Porter, Celluloid Heroes by The Kinks, Right Before Your Eyes by Ian Thomas, Betty Davis Eyes by Kim Carnes, Living on My Own by Freddie Mercury, Garbo by Falco, and Vogue by Madonna. And the artist William Kentridge also made a drawing of Greta. And that was the life of Greta Garbo. Thank you so much for listening to the 24th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf. I am covering 15 people this season, and I don't know if you've been keeping track of how many people that I've already covered, but Greta was number 14. So that means next week will be number 15. And it's probably going to be the season finale, because I think I can cover the next person with just one episode. It feels like forever ago since we started this season. Next week's episode is going to be about Malcolm X. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Instagram is at history_shelf_pod. The Twitter/X is at History Shelf Pod, and the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will give you a shout out on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of that episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of thanks mail to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want except for the Zippo hoodie. You can also take out ad space. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. Also, if you click on one of the affiliated links and buy something that helps support the podcast, there's one for Riverside, one for Amazon, and one for Bookshop. But if you don't want any of the merch, and you don't want any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support the podcast, I've turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes for this episode. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is to just continue to listen to it. And there are a couple other ways you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. All right, well, until next week, keep learning, keep living history, and come back for next week's episode.